Okay, looks like everything is good, so we're going to go forwards with that. If something else pops up, please don't hesitate to send me another message here. Okay, so what is a PDA? And a PDA, if you're online with us today, probably you have some idea of what that is already, but a PDA is a physical demands assessment, and the point of a PDA is to systematically and objectively quantify the physical requirements of a job. Typically, we focus on the essential duties of the job, but occasionally we also include the non-essential, depending on the types of work that somebody does. So examples, really the difference between the two is an essential duty is an essential or required function in order to complete the job, but there are lots of non-essential duties that folks do as well. So for example, somebody has to typically takes garbage away from their workstation when their garbage bin gets full or something starts to back up for them. There is potentially somebody designed to do that, but they might do that regularly as part of the process, just to make sure that their workstation is neat and tidy. And so when that happens, then ultimately we consider that to be a non-essential duty, that it's not something that they have to do, but they may do as part of their normal regular duties. So we do document both of those on occasion. The focus for a PDA is typically on the physical details only. We could also complete a cognitive demands assessment, and for some of you, the folks on here today, that is a relevant document that, well, it's relevant for everyone, but it is more relevant for some than others. So we certainly could complete a cognitive demands assessment to go along with that, and with the new mental health legislation, some of our clients have definitely been moving this direction, trying to document what the physical requirements of the job are, as well as what the cognitive requirements of the job are, to make sure that we're getting a full picture, and that if somebody needs to be accommodated back into the job, that you understand what the physical and or cognitive requirements are, so you can determine if there is a job match, right? So when you combine the two, it typically is called a job demands assessment, not just a PDA, CDA, although you can call it that as well. But it's all, the key part to remember here is that it's systematic and it's objective, right? And that information is really important, that this is not someone standing there thinking, yeah, I think it's about 50 pounds. That box is about 50 pounds, or that object is about 30 pounds. And yeah, they lift it 2 or 3 times per shift. It's objective, right? That we should know exactly how much that box weighs. And if it varies because you run multiple different processes, for example, or that they don't always lift the same piece of equipment, we should be documenting the variances as well as how frequently it occurs, right? All these are the objective numbers that we want to gather to determine, to make a PDA truly objective and detailed, right? So that's really what we're looking for here, is a very objective, detailed PDA, because that information, ultimately, the reason we want the objectivity and the detail is because that information becomes what allows you to make a successful return to work process, right? To make a successful job match and bring someone back, or an unsuccessful one if you don't have all the details that you need. It can also waste a lot of time. If you get, if you have a PDA that doesn't have all the detail you need, then you get some restrictions. You think, shoot, I don't know if there is lifting above, I know they lift, but I don't actually know if they lift above shoulder or not. And this person's restriction says they can't lift above shoulder. Then what happens at that point is that you now have to go out and physically look at that job, which is a waste of time, right? That shouldn't be the case. It should be objectively documented in that PDA, not only lifting weights, but for example, the lifting heights, because we know that oftentimes working above shoulder height, for example, is a restriction that you will see, you will often see from a doctor, right? They give some variables like that, right? So we want that detail, we want that level of information so that we can successfully make that job match. So you can use your PDA in all kinds of different ways. I would say that the vast majority of our clients are using their PDA as a retroactive tool. So typically someone is getting an injury, right? They've experienced some sort of musculoskeletal disorder injury, or any kind of injury really, and are attempting to come back to work, right? So now you're looking at, is this job a good match for this employee's abilities or restrictions? So you're performing some sort of job match, right, to figure out if you can bring them back. If it's not the perfect match as it stands currently, then they're looking at accommodation options with that PDA. Okay, so let's think about your lifting example. Lifting above shoulder height is a restriction this employee has. They can't lift above shoulder height. So now you need to look into your PDA and figure out, you know what, this job requires some lifting above shoulder height, but it's for rare tasks, right? We don't have to lift above shoulder height very frequently. Maybe they lift above shoulder height to load a piece of machinery, but they load it like one box every 2 or 3 hours. It doesn't occur very frequently, so now the accommodation might be that someone else is able to perform that task, and then that job, it becomes suitable because now I don't have any work performed above shoulder height, right? So that's the reactive or the retroactive approach. You might also send the PDA to a doctor to help explain what the job is, because, you know, as you know, I'm sure you've experienced in the past, you can't picture a job, right, that you've never seen before. So one of your employees goes in to see a doctor, tells them about what they do, and the doctor has no idea what some of these pieces of equipment are that they're working with. We had a good case actually a while ago of this, or I guess you consider it a bad case perhaps, but ultimately this employee said they have to change tooling in a machine. And so the doctor came back, and, you know, as many doctors' notes do, they don't have the full picture, and they should be providing us functional information, but sometimes they say things like can't drive a forklift, and instead of telling me that they can't sit for prolonged periods of time or they can't reach for prolonged periods of time, which would give me the information I need to know about accommodation, they say I can't, you know, operate a forklift. Well, in this case, we had an employee come back and they said, you know, handed the doctor's note over and says can't change tooling. So we're like, well, that's really weird, because every other restriction that you have doesn't really speak to anything that's making me concerned. So in the end, when we you know, encourage the client to send the PDA over and get more detailed information about why they can't do this component of the job, the doctor was surprised to learn what changing the tooling actually looked like. We were talking about small pieces of tooling, like we're talking about, I'm going to say a few centimeters long, very lightweight, very small, right? That there was really no physical limitation that would say they couldn't use or do this job. Whereas the doctor was likely picturing, when you say a tool, you're probably picturing something a whole lot bigger than than a 2 or 3 centimeter thing, right? You're picturing something like a hammer or a screwdriver, maybe something heavy, right? And we were talking things that were millimeters. And so the doctor, you know, in this case, didn't actually go the extra mile to figure out what that meant, right? But the PDA allows you to provide some of that detail. So there is less ambiguity there. It's much clearer for the doctor about what the job actually is, what the job actually requires, that can help with that return to work process and the accommodation piece. You may also use it for other medical practitioners. Physiotherapists, for example, are good examples of when you might want to provide a PDA, because they are typically working on rehabilitation and strength improvements depending on the type of injury, and they may actually gear or could potentially gear some of their treatments to address some of the concerns or issues that your employee is experiencing with their exact job, right? So there can be some benefits here to using it. There are always benefits to using it reactively, but ideally we actually move to the right, in the positive direction. I don't want to just use documentation after there's an injury, right? That's always reactive. You never get ahead of the curve. You're always putting out fires. There's nothing fun in that, right? It's always frustrating, right? So ideally, we're moving towards a proactive approach, right? So we could use this, a PDA, as a screening tool. So for some of our clients, for example, we do post-offer employment testing. So they have some jobs that are very physical. They can't design out the physical elements of that job. And so we have developed a screening assessment, a physical screening assessment, to evaluate the physical abilities of an employee moving into a position, to determine whether it is a suitable position for that person's physical strength, right, or physical mobility. And so we can use the PDA to objectively describe what the job is and then create criteria or screening around that. We can also talk about hazard identification. Your PDA does highlight some of those things. You have to grab that information and pull it out a bit, but your PDA does grab some of that information and show you where lifting occurs above shoulder height, show you where lifting occurs above, let's say you set a criteria, you know, we looked at our risk assessments. We really don't want any lifting above 25 pounds. Which jobs have lifting above 25 pounds? Because that's probably an area that there's a hazard. right? And you could take that information even one step further, looking at, you're gathering the same data for a PDA as you are for a risk assessment. You can start to pull some details out there. So often we think about a PDA as a reactive piece of our process, and it probably is, but it's also nice to remember that it can be something that becomes more proactive, right? More ahead of the curve rather than constantly being a lagging thing that you're dealing with after an injury. So let's spend a few minutes comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges, depending on how you want to look at these PDA examples. I have about 4 or 5 examples in here to show you, just to highlight what the differences are. You may recognize PDAs that look very similar to the ones that you have currently. And it doesn't mean that the PDA you have isn't working for you, because it might be. But we want to make sure that you are thinking analytically about the PDA. Is it really doing everything that you need it to do, right? So if you identify that, oh, one of these samples that she's showing is actually a PDA like the one I have, and you know what, I'm struggling with this, or I'm constantly have to go out and look for more information after I get a restrictions from a doctor. Those are things that you should be mindful of, right? That means your PDA probably isn't working for you fully. And so let's explore a little bit more about what these different types of PDAs are and where some of the pros and cons fall on them. If you see a PDA that you recognize, or if you have questions about a type of a PDA in addition to the stuff I'm talking about, please jump in and ask those questions now. It's a great exercise for folks to review their PDAs and think critically about them as we go through this. Okay, so let's start by talking about a checkbox-based PDA. So there are a whole variety of these. I actually think I have 2 samples in here of checkbox-based PDAs. And we see these a lot. There are several different providers out there that we run across regularly that use what I would describe as a checkbox PDA. So you can see on the left in the picture there that it gives you a weight range, and it actually gives you a height as well. So this is nice. It says lifting from floor to waist, or lifting from waist to from waist level to, I should say shoulder level there actually, or lifting from floor to shoulder. It's trying to evaluate what range do you move through during this lift, which is nice because we know some of our restrictions are associated with that, and there would be further lifting documents. I've just pulled one page here, so there'll be further lifting ranges on the next pages. And then it asks you the frequency with which it happens. So is it not required, right? Doesn't happen at all. Is it rare? Only 1 to 5%. Is it occasional? 6 to 33, frequent 34 to 66, or constant 67 to 100%. So these are, like I said, this is a very common PDA. We see it a lot. So some of the benefits of a checkbox-based PDA, I've got them listed up there. Typically, they're pretty simple. Right? They're pretty simple, which makes them fairly easy to read. The example I have up here was actually provided to me from a client who was asking some questions and asked me to review a PDA they had. And I'll be honest, this is one of the best examples of a checkbox-based PDA that I've ever seen, particularly because the person who completed this PDA did a wonderful job of filling out the comments. The comment section on this is much more detailed than what I usually see. Right, so the pieces in particular that I love in the comments here are all the weights and some of the measurements. So for example, in the first box there, talking about safety brackets of some kind of press are 20 pounds, are stored on the ground. Gives you a reference to height, give you a reference to weight, which is wonderful. The crane lifting eyes are lifted rarely, weighing 10.5 pounds, stored on low-level shelves, which are approximately 9 inches from the ground. I will tell you that one of the biggest gaps I see in a checkbox PDA is that the comment section isn't filled out very thoroughly. And the problem is that without the comment section filled out very thoroughly, the checkboxes do not give you enough detail, right? There's no detail here. It just says that lifting occurs occasionally. If I don't take time to write in the comment section what they lift, how frequently they lift it, perhaps where they start or where they finish that lift from, then ultimately what I get is a very undetailed PDA. The flip side of that is this one's an excellent example of how to fill this out and get really thorough with it. I do believe this provider did a pretty good job of filling out this template, but what you probably notice very quickly is that this is really wordy. If you want to quickly and easily sort out which pieces, how you're going to accommodate someone, for example, This PDA doesn't make it super easy to do that, right? I have to read every one of these bullet points to figure out what the weights are, to figure out how frequently they occur, right? And really that becomes a bit of a challenge. So now I know that I have a lifting restriction. You know, on this page alone, I've got 3 bullets in the floor to waist, and I've got 6 bullets in the waist to shoulder, it should be, and then lifting from floor to shoulder level, I've got 1 bullet here, but there's actually more on the next pages, right? So I'm looking at very easily like I don't know, 8, 10, 12 bullets that I have to read thoroughly in order to grab the detail out of this PDA that I need in order to accommodate. Which is why accommodating with a checkbox-based PDA can be a challenge, right? Is that you either get great detail, but you have to sift through it all, or you get no detail at all, and the comments aren't filled out hardly at all, and then it really does no good to you, because when you start to look and say, okay, this person can't lift more than 20 pounds. All right, well, it shows here in the lifting from waist level to above shoulder that waist level to shoulder level, excuse me, there's 21 to 50 pound lifts that occurs rarely, and there's greater than 50 pound lifts are not required. So I know there are a few lifts here that are 21 to 50 pounds, which are greater than my employee's restriction of 20 pounds, but without all this comment section, you have no idea what those lifts are. So how do you accommodate that position when you don't know what it is that's above 21 pounds? Now, ultimately, the answer would be that you have to go back out and figure it out, right? So now you're going to spend, depending on how detailed and how much weight they lift that's above that, or many items they lift that's above that 20 pound mark, you might have to weigh a whole lot of things to figure out what pieces you could potentially even accommodate here. So that for me is a major drawback, right? Is that it's difficult to accommodate, and if it's not difficult to accommodate because the detail's there, it's very wordy and hard to sift through, right? One of the main pros I see here is that because it's a fairly simple PDA to complete, it is more easily completed in-house. Now, the question becomes, do you want to complete them in-house? And I would argue that perhaps you don't, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it can be easier to complete in-house and require very basic training in order to be able to do that. Now, they can be done really poorly, right, without some training. So I would still encourage you to do some training, but they can be done pretty well. If you are able to fill out this check, put the X's in the right boxes, and be able to provide some basic content about what the lifting, things they are lifting, using obviously this page as my example, the things that they're lifting, the weights, the frequencies, then you get an okay PDA, which provides enough detail probably to get you through certainly some basic accommodations. One of the questions I asked is, or I just hinted at, is, do you want to complete this in-house? And that's actually a question I'm going to pose to you guys. Do you currently do them in-house? Do you prefer to do your PDAs by an external consultant? How do you approach this problem or this concern? So you can fill in a little question or a chat. Okay, so I've got one popping up here that's suggesting they prefer external, which is great. And why do you prefer external, Annette? Not to put you on the spot here. Oh, and I've got another one responding saying the same thing. Okay, so looking at external, and ultimately it allows for a better defense in court or in the WSIB, and that's really where I would agree with you, and that's really why I would argue in most cases you want your PDAs to be done by someone external, whoever that may be, is that there could be a conflict of interest, right? If you are completing your PDAs in-house and you are saying, I want someone to come back to do I want someone to come back and do this assessment, or I want someone to come back to work, and here's the PDA, and here's their restrictions, and here's why there's a match. When you look at the WSIB, or the WSIB looks at it and they see that you completed the PDA, there may be some question about an ulterior motive, right? Are you are you filling this out correctly? Were you qualified to do that? And if you are qualified to do that, if you had the sufficient training and things, which is great, we have a few folks online today that have done training with us on how to complete these, and you certainly can do that. And then in that case, at least you have some leg to stand on that you are somewhat qualified to complete these. But the question they may ask, and we have had it asked in the past, is ultimately, is this objective enough? Is there now a conflict of interest because you're trying to bring someone back to work? You're saying there's a job match. The employee is arguing there's not a job match, but you're the one that completed the PDA. So you hold all the cards in this case, right? You wrote the PDA that describes that there's a job match. The employee disagrees, and that can become a tricky situation. So in those cases, sometimes it's nice to have that third party have completed the PDA, because then it stands on its own, right? So that can be to an advantage as well. Yes. And the point someone's making is, what if you don't work there in the next 3 or 4 years, when it becomes a problem, then maybe it's not an easy solution, but if you don't have to worry about it. But if you are the person obviously that completed the PDA and you're the person dealing with the claims management piece, trying to say this is a good match, that can be tricky. Okay, so that's sample number 1. Not necessarily bad. They can be very detailed, but it does take some thoughts or some participation. And a good point here, actually, that Lynn is making is that they do a lot of their PDAs in-house, but they have the employees participate and they sign off along with the assessor and the supervisor. And that's a good way to address some of that concern, right? That we actually want to make sure that if you are going to complete them in-house, that you have had multiple parties sign off on this to show that this is a valid PDA, that the details that are in here are accurate, which is a great way to especially if you have to defend it, is that you've got buy-in from all the parties. So if you do it in-house, I certainly think getting it signed off is a great suggestion. Okay, some different examples of another checkbox-based PDA. The pros and the cons here are still the same, but you can see, hopefully you can start to see a little bit of the differences here. This is also checkbox-based, but not really as detailed as the previous one, right? The checkboxes seem more detailed, but the actual content, when you get right down to figuring out how you accommodate someone or not, becomes a little bit trickier. So let's go back to that lifting section, because that's the one we just had, so it's easiest to compare. So the lifting section in the previous one was quite detailed. It gave you several different ranges of movement, right, from below waist, waist to shoulder, and then from floor to shoulder, right, gave you some different examples there. So that was a whole page worth just for strength, just for lifting, not even strength, just for lifting. This PDA incorporates all the strength components in a half a page or less. Right, so the detail is lost here because you can't have as much detail if you're talking about less than half the volume of content you had before. So the one thing this does do in particular, which we see a lot as well, is when documenting weights and forces, they document a range and a usual, sometimes they call that typical weight. So they say, okay, typically below waist lifting we know it's between 1 and 2.5 pounds. The most frequent or typical weight that's lifted in that range is 1.5, in this case kilograms, 1.5 kilograms. And then they provide a quick example of the types of things that are lifted. In this case, clothing, cleaners, disinfectants, shoes, and socks. And granted, we're not talking about, in this example, we're not talking about very heavy weights. So does it matter as much? No, it doesn't, because we're not talking about more than 2.5 pounds. But if this range was 1 to 25 pounds and the usual weight was, say, 5 pounds, and then you just list a bunch of things that they lift with no reference to what the weights are that each of those items are, you now again have to go back out, figure out which of those items are above this person's abilities, which ones can you accommodate, which ones can't, right? How frequently do they get lifted? And it gets hard to sort of sort through all the different components. So Checkbox PDA, still simple, still pretty easy to read, but doesn't necessarily have the level of detail that you want in order to address all of the accommodation issues that you might come across. The other con that I didn't mention on the last slide is that typically in a checkbox-based PDA, the postural assessment is underrepresented, which means that they just don't provide as much detail on the posture component. And so what happens is you end up with with some difficulty accommodating someone who has a restriction based on posture. So how far they have to reach. For example, they can't work to more than 15 inches in front of their body. That's not really documented well in a typical checkbox-based PDA. Any questions about the checkbox-based PDAs? If you have them and you have a particular question, we've certainly seen them a lot. I can probably speak to that. Feel free to continue typing in the box there, and we can come back to any checkbox-based PDA questions. The third sample I've put in here, because we do see this one often as well, is the WSIB PDA. So this is available online for you to fill out, and it is actually really meant for the employer to fill out. So it is, good pros and cons to this. In particular, pro is that it's accepted, right? That the WSIB recognizes this PDA because, well, they should, they created it. So they recognize this PDA. But what it's typically used for, when you read the instructions and the details here, is it's not really meant to be a PDA for the whole job, right? It specifically is looking at the person's restrictions only. So if the person has a shoulder restriction, then you're going to only fill out components of the job that are reflective or that would impact the shoulders, movement, range of motion, strength that might impact the shoulder. You're really only speaking to that. You're not speaking to the full representation of the job. So that creates some, that's fine from a one injury perspective, right? That this PDA, if you're using it for Susie's injury and Susie has a shoulder injury, you're filling this out according to her specific discomforts to show that there's a match or that there's not, or how you're going to accommodate this person. That's fine. But what happens when 6 months down the road you have another injury on that job, a shoulder injury as well, but this time it's Jose that was injured, right? And now you have Jose, his injury is a little bit different. Maybe it's not even a shoulder injury, maybe it's a hand-wrist injury, let's say, and you have no physical demands information for this injury at all, because all you did this time was speak to the shoulder, right? And you might have spoken to a very specific type of shoulder discomfort, maybe not even a full representation of the shoulder issues associated with this position. So you might even find that you have two different shoulder injuries on the same job, and this PDA doesn't do a good job of capturing that. Right, so that can be one of the limitations here. One of the other major limitations that we have, or concerns we have with this PDA specifically, is its length. It is very wordy. There's not a ton of pictures. There are some, or you could put some in, but the PDA itself, when you first download it without filling in any content, it is 11 pages long, and that can be very long and very detailed. And if you think back to the first slides, I said in some cases you're going to send this to WSIB, or you're going to send it to a medical practitioner. If you think a doctor is reading an 11-page document, you're definitely you're quite hopeful. I hope they're reading it. That'd be amazing. But I think the reality is they're spending a few minutes, they're quickly skimming, not getting a good picture because there's too much detail here. So it's sort of a catch-22. It works well for the WSIB, but only for sort of injury by injury specific. It's not really great when you get outside of that person's injury, and it can be very long, which creates limitations in other areas. So it's not my favorite representation of a PDA and what that could look like, but it is available to you and certainly accepted, and you could work to fill that out if that's something that you have. So the fourth sample I've put in here is an example of our PDA to try and show you how we've addressed some of these concerns that we have looked at in the past. So our PDA is also widely accepted by the WSIB. We've never had it turned away. We've never had a client told that they need to go back and complete a PDA, or that there's not enough detail. And our clients are typically happy with how much detail is in here and how easily they're able to work through an accommodation process with the information provided. So you'll see ours has words, but words primarily organized into a chart format. There's a little bit of sort of an introduction stuff on the first page, but the vast majority of our PDA speaks to a chart format, which makes it easier to process and grab information quickly. So if you need to know, is there lifting above shoulder, you're going to jump down to the lifting section, you're going to look at the above shoulder section, and very quickly you should be able to say whether lifting above shoulder is required or not, to determine if there's a match or not with an employee's restrictions. In the example I provided, it's an admin assistant. There won't be a lot of lifting in this job anyways, but there is no lifting above shoulder. So you'd know pretty quickly that that's not a component of this person's restrictions that you need to be worried about. Right. So there are some distinct advantages, I think, to this type of a PDA. One thing I didn't mention on the previous ones, on the first checkbox-based PDA in particular, that is also present on ours, is this is the legend at the top there, the frequency ranges. So if you think back to the first checkbox-based PDA, you will see that they use the same scoring system. So something that occurs 1 to 5% of your day is rare, 6 to 33% is occasional, 34 to 66% is frequent, and 67 to 100% is constant. And those aren't arbitrary. That's why you see them on our PDA and on several others that are out there. This is not an arbitrary thing. Those numbers are straight from NIOSH. So they reference frequency standards that we would expect to see on all, really you should expect to see that on all your PDAs. They should be in line with those numbers, in particular because they also translate to layman's terms, right? When a doctor's note often doesn't say that that person can only lift for 25% of their day. It would way more likely say that a person can perform occasional lifting no greater than 20 pounds, right, for example. And so you need to figure out what the heck occasional means, right? What does occasional mean? Because that's open to interpretation. And the idea behind these NIOSH guidelines is that it really takes some of the guesswork out. So when you see a term like frequent or occasional, which are very common in a doctor's note, you can use that to, and the WSIB would recognize this, that you can interpret that to mean occasional means less than 33% of the shift, and frequent means 34 to 66% of the shift, then obviously a constant and rare in there too. But you can use those verbiage rules like occasional and frequent and convert them into actual percentages, which helps you determine whether an accommodation is A, necessary, and B, possible within this job. Right, so you can see how we've broken it down: below knuckle, knuckle to shoulder, above shoulder. We also use the strength guidelines of carrying, pushing, pulling. There's a whole bunch of variety of elements in there, and we try and break it up based on the types of things that they're lifting. So if they're lifting something, for example, let's look at the carrying section. They would lift all these things kind of at the same time, right? So if this admin assistant is probably setting up for a meeting of some kind, so they would handle coffee pots, trays, plates, etc. to set up for the meeting. All those get lumped together because that's appropriate for the frequency with which they're lifting. They also might set up AV materials, which has a little bit of a different weight range and sort of a different category. And then they also deliver some brochures to various facilities within, this is a municipal job, so various brochures within a facility, within multiple facilities, and that's the weight range for those. So we don't lump it all together. We try and break it out a little bit to be most logical, because again, if you're trying to accommodate someone and you say, okay, no lifting above 10 pounds, I can quickly look through this PDA and say, okay, brochure boxes are not okay. 15 to 20 pounds are brochure boxes, so we need to take those out. They can't do that job. But we're talking about 2 to 3 times a year for 10 to 20 times per occasion. So they drive around to 10 or 20 sites, or they drive to 5 sites to get out of the car a couple times each. But we're talking 2 or 3 times a year. I am sure that we can accommodate that out because it happens very rarely, and it's one of the only things that's really above this person's weight. Right, weight restrictions. So I can quickly determine that that's an easy thing to accommodate out, and I can, that can be a quick accommodation that I'm suggesting to the WSIB. Right, so that's kind of how we've broken things down to provide you with a simple view that you can use for an accommodation purpose. I also indicated earlier that one of the things that the WSIB PDA does a little bit better job, but the checkbox PDAs do a poor job of, is postural assessment. And we think this is a pretty important component because like like your doctor's notes, you are going to get references that say that someone can't reach. Now you have to do a little bit of interpreting. Reaching is, sometimes it's shoulder flexion, it's reaching in front. Sometimes it's shoulder abduction, it's reaching to the side. But ultimately, they're giving you some reference points as to what reaching might look like, that they can't look down for prolonged periods of time, that they can't bend forwards, right? They have to maintain a neutral back posture for 85% of their day, right? They give you some good reference points, and those postural components or postural references, it's important to find them in your PDA as well. So again, you don't have to go back and doing any research, right? You should have all that at your fingertips so that you can move forwards with making an accommodation quickly or determining that the job isn't suitable and there are some other options you should be considering. Right, so all of that should be, I think, included in your PDA to get a really good picture of what this job requires. So let's talk a little bit more about the essentials of a PDA now that we've seen and compared a few different examples here. One thing we think is essential is a quality summary page. A lot of the PDAs that you will see have a summary page on there, and what is included on that summary page is entirely customizable to what you would like it to be. But you have to remember that when, you know, your PDA might be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages, depending on how complex your job is. And so if you think about a WSIB, if you think about a doctor, other medical practitioners, they are not reading 10 pages of content. So this is the first impression they're going to get, and it might be the only thing that they read in any detail at all. So this is where you're going to have the best opportunity to summarize the information from the inside of the document here and give somebody a snapshot or a first impression or a best understanding of what this job is. So you want to be mindful of what goes on this first page. In particular, you want some of the basics like the job title, the descriptions, if you have a manufacturing type facility, production rates appropriate, job rotation, that kind of thing. We would also encourage you to include some pictures, which we've got on there, and I'll talk about pictures again in another couple slides here. But perhaps the most important part is this breakdown of the essential duties of the job, the tasks or the duties that are required. So usually what we'd be looking for here is, we'll use your admin assistant as a person, right, as this job. So somebody's doing an admin assistant PDA, some of your essential tasks or duties are going to be a significant chunk of your time is going to be computer-based work, right? So computer-based work, that would be one of your essential duties, right? Computer work. Another essential duty might be telephone usage, right? Answering or taking calls on the phone. Another one, thinking about the PDA example I provided, is obviously setting up for meetings, right? So AV requirements, food, etc., as appropriate. And then maybe, again, thinking about the other one we have is driving to multiple sites and delivering brochures. All of those are essential tasks or duties of the job. And then we want to know what the essential tasks are and then approximately how much time they spend doing that task. Because again, you may need to accommodate one of these tasks out. You may identify that the brochures, as we used it earlier as an example, is not an appropriate task for this person to be doing based on their restrictions. But you could quickly see on the very first page that okay, brochures aren't okay for this person to do, but they do them 2 or 3 times a year, right? So this is something I can handle, I can accommodate out. If someone cannot work on the computer, for example, likely this is going to show them that the hours that they spend per shift is probably 6, 7-ish hours per shift of an 8-hour shift. It's pretty difficult to accommodate someone who cannot work on the computer and when that's the significant, obviously the vast majority of their time. They spend 75% of their day on the computer. Probably I'm not going to be able to accommodate that one easily unless I happen to be able to figure out a different way for them to work on the computer, like dictation software or something. Right, so that gives you sort of a picture or a quick snapshot. It also is nice in here to include details about the shift length, the breaks, any job rotation that's included. And you'll notice on the bottom in our quality assurance component, like mentioned earlier by Lynn actually, is that we often encourage you to get sign off. Any PDA that we complete externally or you do internally, ideally you are getting a manager and or employee to sign off on them to confirm that what the data that is included is accurate. And the ideal is also that they're revised regularly. So our rule of thumb is generally every 3 years in an ideal world, you would be updating your PDA. That does not mean you have to do them from scratch. It means that somebody goes in, reviews the PDA content, takes a look at the job and says, yes, this is the same, everything is the same, fabulous, we're signing off a new date of May 14th, 2018. I'm putting your name down, right, to say that everything that I saw is the same as it was before. But you might also find that it's not the same, because we know in the last 5 years or so, things have changed in this job and the processes. They've got a new piece of equipment. Now everybody in the office has got sit-stand desks, for example. So the amount of time spent sitting is no longer the same. So now in this case, we go back, we make a couple minor updates throughout the PDA. We come back here, put our revised date on there, and sign off. So it's meant to be an active document. It should be something you're reviewing and updating regularly, because the WSIB, if you hand them a PDA that's 15 years old and expect them to accept that as current, you're going to find that you get some kickback from that most often. It doesn't have to be that you've done a major renovation of the document, but you do have to have reviewed the job and make sure that the content in here is still current. Pardon me. Okay, ideally we're looking at making sure your PDA is applicable for your work. For example, PDAs for an assembly line worker don't capture the same data as someone who works in a healthcare environment or in a municipality on the side of the road, right? Those are very different types of work. Most importantly, they're very different frequencies. Like an assembly line job is going to say, let's say they have a cycle time of 15 seconds. And so you're going to be representing everything as how many seconds out of 15 seconds do they do this movement or this lift or whatever it is. Whereas you're talking about a roads worker on the side of the road in a ditch or working in a piece of heavy machinery, they're going to spend hours of a shift in there, and their PDA should look different. So it's kind of a catch-22. You should make sure your PDA sort of is applicable or has been customized a little bit for the type of work you do, but it should also be standardized across a variety of jobs. Most facilities we go to, or most organizations, have sort of one or the other, right? They're either pretty quick cycle time type jobs or work in the office. That's usually the two, sort of in a manufacturing type environment, industrial world. Or you have somebody who does something that takes really long cycles. If there's even a cycle, there's a lot of variety in the work that they do. And so the PDAs for those two different types of work do look a bit different. So it's something just to consider as you're setting out to edit, revise, or create a template, is think about the type of work you do and pick or modify a template that's appropriate for that. So you want more opportunity to write, for example, and provide the comments and the details in a job that has a very long cycle or no cycle at all, right? Your municipal roads worker needs a longer PDA because they need more detail to include the variety of tasks that they do, right? Whereas your short cycle time on an assembly line, quick and easy. You're going to write 3 things. They pick up part A, they insert it into part B, and they return it to the line, right? That's all you're going to say for that. It's going to be quick, short, and sweet. And so you need a different level of detail in those 2 PDAs. As I mentioned earlier in our example, you want to make sure your information is easy to find. So the layout here is important. You want to minimize the opportunity for anybody as they're filling it out to provide any quote unquote flair or put their own style into it, right? We want this to be nice and consistent. This is especially true if you have multiple people filling out this document. So let's say you train 10 people to complete PDAs and they start working away completing PDAs. You get them all back and you realize that they have all done something a little bit different. Now there is no consistency. It's difficult to find all the information you need. Some people fill out this section in really great detail, but other sections in very limited detail. Some people do a mediocre job on all of it. Some people add a lot of comments. Some people don't. It becomes very hard to navigate through these and be efficient with your time on the back end, right? Now I have an injury case. I need to pull up this PDA. I realize quickly that, Jennifer filled it out and she pretty much always fills it out in mediocre detail. So I know I'm going to have to go back out and gather some more information, right? That's not ideal. We should, ideally, the layout sort of very clearly guides people through what should go in each section. So it's simple and easy to fill out, and hopefully in that case, more consistent. I've mentioned a couple times already the importance of clear, concise, and objective. And so the NIOSH frequency data I referenced already, right? It should follow that standardized information because that is recognized by the WSIB. And if you have information from the doctor that says occasional and you can demonstrate that the job occurs less than 33% of the shift, then you can make a pretty good case that this meets this individual's restrictions. right? It also needs to be objective. So just like that first checkbox-based PDA that had all those numbers and the really long wordy comments in it, they provided great information about the weights that were lifted. If you got down to the pushing pulling section, there are forces that have been objectively measured. These aren't guesses. Somebody took a scale out and actually weighed stuff. Somebody took a force gauge and pushed and pulled a cart, or pushed and pulled a lever to try and figure out what forces are required. Somebody has measured the heights and the reaches, right? That, again, that example I used earlier, they were able to say reaching down to shelving that's approximately 9 inches high. That's objective data. Someone has measured that. It's not just they eyeballed it and said, I think it's 9 inches, right? So they have objectively measured that and have been able to include that detail in the PDA, and that's super helpful. And obviously distances traveled, any kind of numbers you can put into your PDA, the better it will be. What it ultimately allows for is that others can obtain the same information. So if you want to go to validate some of this information later to say, I need to sign off or revise this, it's been 3 years. So I'm going to send out Paul with my PDA to say, okay, Paul, make sure this is all accurate. He should be able to do that quickly and easily with the information that is in the PDA, right? He shouldn't have to weigh a whole bunch of things to try and figure out if the ranges that are included are appropriate or not. He should know that, the bags that we're lifting are anywhere between 20 and 25 kilograms, weigh a couple and be like, yep, that's still what we have, great, moving forwards, right? It should not be something that's difficult to do. And you want to avoid subjective wording. So things like it's a fast cycle or it's a heavy piece of equipment, those are all subjective words. They mean nothing. And ultimately, when you want to be particularly careful when you're talking about things like heavy and fast, because the WSIB sees those words and it's possible that your claim would get approved because you used a subjective word. It's important that you're mindful of the language that you're using to make it objective so that you don't have somebody just reading going, oh, this is a heavy job. Oh, this occurs really quickly. Oh, it occurs too frequently because you've said frequent in there somewhere. Eliminate all those kinds of value words and put the numbers in, right? It's not heavy. It's 25 pounds. That might be heavy, but it might not be, right? Let's eliminate that word altogether. Put the exact weight in. It's fast. It occurs quickly. Well, what's the cycle time? Is the cycle time 15 seconds? Is it 45 seconds? Does it occur quickly but only for 2 or 3 minutes of a shift, right? Provide that kind of detail so that you can use that to make cases, to accept or deny claims moving forwards for accommodation purposes. That's the kind of detail that gets you to the end game you want. I mentioned pictures. Pictures really do speak 1,000 words. Describing what the job requires. Obviously, I've got some very different examples here, but I used my example earlier of the tooling, right? Without a picture to describe what we're talking about here, the doctor didn't understand, right? The doctor didn't get the information. They heard the word tooling and they pictured something else entirely. So it's important that you provide pictures. I would strongly encourage that. Even if the employee, you don't want the employee in there, that's fine. But pictures of the tools and equipment that they're working with is the ideal. If possible, pictures of the employee in the certain postures that they're going to be required to adopt to do the essential duties of the job would be the best case scenario. But if you can't get the employer, they're not willing to be in the pictures, at the very minimum, equipment, tools, workstation layouts should all be in there. So take several pictures and try and get as many in there as possible to provide a better overall image, or allow the reader to make a better image of what this job actually requires. Don't leave it up to their interpretation, in other words. I mentioned sign off earlier, and it came up as one of our comments earlier. A PDA is assessed in a bubble, and it may not capture the entire job. So, for example, sometimes I go out and I hear from an employee, they're like, oh, I really wish you weren't here today. Today's been a really easy day, but when all hell breaks loose around here, this job can be really difficult because of X, Y, and Z. Well, if that employee hadn't taken the time to say that to me out loud, what I would have seen is a job that was pretty easy, right? That things were going pretty smooth that day and they weren't having a lot of downtime. The machine wasn't going down. So I was seeing a very smooth day, and that's what I would have captured in the PDA without someone giving me that information that things can go awry. And when it does, all of a sudden we're hand bombing everything, and it happens once or twice a week, and we have to hand bomb 3 skids worth of product, and you're thinking, oh, well, that would significantly change the physical demands, right? So it is a snapshot in time. That's all I get to see. So when you get sign off from key components, right, an employee sign off, a management sign off, it helps to ensure that the document is accurate, and then all of those oddities, or there's no non-standard times, are captured on that document. Ultimately, as Lynn indicated earlier, it can also minimize that controversy during the return to work process. You get a lot better buy-in from your WSIB if your employees have signed off to say, yes, this is accurate, if your management team signed off to say, yes, this is accurate, right? Everybody has already bought into this. This is particularly true if you have a union. So they're also a good team to get sign off on that, to say that this is accurate. They can be difficult to get the sign off on, but especially if you have somebody external do them, they can certainly bounce questions off and get the clarity they need to hopefully make them comfortable enough to put their little John Henry on there. I talked about review date already, right? Minor changes tend to get missed over time. Major changes that happen, like I had a client, for example, who implemented a lift assist on multiple lines of their facility. Chances are good the PDA got updated when that happened. It's a pretty major capital investment. It was a big project for them. They were very excited about it. Chances are good the PDA got an update after that. But the little things that change over time, a new tool, a new process, a change in frequency, a new customer, therefore changing the speed or the size of a product, those little things often get missed. We don't take the time to update the PDA all the time. So that's what that review component is super important for, right? It allows you to go back, revisit it, make sure it's still accurate. So an annual review is amazing because it's going to capture some of those minor changes. The minimum we recommend is about 3 years to get a new sign off. It just ensures that data is always valid. So all the content is relevant and current, and that's the most important part when you go to present this to other stakeholders. If you're doing a really good job of your PDA, this is where it can take you to the next level, right? So this is where your risk assessment information can be grabbed from your PDA, and you can start to run or compare the information you're gathering about the job requirements, and then you could take all that information from that PDA and you could dump it into a risk assessment to determine whether there is a likelihood of injury here. Right? So a really good PDA, if somebody gets injured and you're trying to fight that the claim couldn't happen, right? That it's not possible that this injury happened on this job, right? We should be able to, in a really good PDA, I should be able to pull most of the data that I need to run a risk assessment from the PDA. Right? I shouldn't even need to come on site again or look at the job a second time. I should be able to grab all the data I need from that PDA in order to run a risk assessment to help demonstrate that the odds of this injury occurring on this job are really slim. And so that is sort of the gold standard in a PDA, is that if you get detailed enough, you should have the information you need to run a risk assessment, or some, thinking future down the road, some other additional information can be gleaned from your PDA that can make it a really beneficial document. So that's just something to be mindful of, is that a good PDA can give you lots of detail. So that's a whole lot of information in a short period of time. I've got about 5 minutes to spare here. So I'm actually going to make 2 offers today. I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants at the moment. Number one is for any of you that are online today with us, right after the webinar here, my colleague Julie is going to send out an email to all of you to ask if you're interested in entering the draw for the free registration for the Industrial Ergonomics Conference. So we are hosting it on June 7th in Mississauga. It's our 3rd annual, and we're really excited to bring a whole bunch of great manufacturers and industrial clients together to talk about some of their ergonomic challenges. And we're happy to give a free registration away to our webinar attendees. So Julie will send out an email here after the webinar. All you have to do is click on respond, and it'll say pick me, and you just send that to us. You don't need to provide any more detail. Once you click on send it a pick me, then ultimately that will all get sent back to us, and we'll make a draw this week about who is the lucky winner of that registration. Now, that said, that doesn't apply to everybody on here today, and I want to talk to folks about PDAs because I think it's a really valuable tool to have in your toolbox, and I don't want you to walk away here feeling like you aren't able to make change or you're not sure what steps to take next. So what I'd like to offer to everybody today is that if you want to set up a time with me to review your existing PDA, I am happy to do that for complimentary. So I'll get Julia to send another email out about PDAs. If you want your PDA reviewed, if you want to talk about the template you're using so that I can give you some pointers or some tips or areas or opportunities for improvement, then I will happily spend a few minutes on the phone with you going through the pros and cons and where your opportunities are, as long as you send me a template ahead of time. So who knew? Until this moment, I didn't know either, but we're going to do 2 offers in one today. So a draw for a free registration to the industrial conference coming up, and then just as importantly, or perhaps more importantly for some of you, an opportunity to speak with an ergonomist about how you could improve your PDA to make it work for you better, right? Because right now it might not be doing everything that it could potentially be doing. So opportunity for now to ask any questions. I've got a few folks just popping things out, which is great. If you have any questions, now's the time to type them into the chat room there. Okay, one of the questions that has just come up is, what do you do? How do you complete a PDA and be objective when you have a very small or a very tall person doing the job? So an interesting question, because obviously the people who do any work are of varying sizes and shapes. And so how do you capture all of that in a PDA? And the short answer is that you don't. Right, that your PDA is not about the person. Your PDA is about the job. So that's why I don't, I measure how far someone has to reach on the table. I don't measure somebody's arm length, for example, right? So I measure from the edge of the table in and say, okay, somebody has to reach in front of the body 14 inches. And then I might say they have to lift something from a box from, from 10 inches from a shelf or a pallet from 5 inches off the ground. I talk about how heavy things are. I don't specifically talk about the person. I try to eliminate the person from the process, but you do obviously have to be mindful of them as you go through it. You want to, I joke that I'm pretty short. I'm not even quite 5'2", and so I'm typically on the low end of most scales. So when I'm doing a PDA, I think about me as the short end. What would I have to do? What's required of me? And then obviously the person I'm watching is most frequently quite a bit taller than I am, so I use that as an opportunity here. Oh, good question, which is that it's difficult to complete a JDA, PDA, and a CDA for jobs with extremely varied tasks, or when trying to complete a JDA when there are a large number of positions. And let me just, that is totally true. And I think that's actually being asked by Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're in a healthcare environment. And so I would agree. It is very difficult to complete a JDA for jobs with varied tasks. And what I would say is that in most cases, this applies to lots of environments like yours, lots of municipalities, lots of healthcare environments, even jobs that have varied tasks, is that we break it down primarily by task rather than by job. So this is where there's a bit of an exception to the rule. In most cases, I would do a whole job in one document. But when I look at a nurse, for example, is that a good example? Sure. When we look at a nurse, for example, they're going to do a whole bunch of different things. So thinking about, they have computer work, they do charting, right? So that happens on the computer. They also are going to be assisting patients in varying capacities. So sometimes they might be transporting patients, right? Pushing wheelchairs, for example, or beds to and from a location. It may not fall to the nurse, but we'll use that as a reference point. They may also be assisting with the transfers of patients. So rolling them on a bed, assisting, getting them into a sling, or using a transfer sheet of some kind in order to be able to do that. And so those are all different examples of tasks. We could put all of that into one document, but we might also separate some of those components out. It depends on how you want to approach it, but you could look at it as sort of 3 mini PDAs, right? That one PDA is about computer work, one PDA is about transferring patients, like physically transferring them on the bed to a sling or to a roll, and the other one is about pushing wheelchairs, for example. I'm not sure that you would want to break those down, but that's just an example I'm pulling out here. Because what you might find is that, again, nurse, a bad example for this, but you might find that you could accommodate someone into, like, they could push wheelchairs down the hallway and they could do the computer work. right? And so I have a PDA that speaks to both of those. And then I have the transferring of patients, the manually transferring of patients, and that is outside the person's abilities. So sometimes those jobs that are complex are better broken down. Again, a nurse isn't a perfect example. I would usually do that one all as one, but I mentioned a roads crew earlier. That would be a great example of where we would typically break that out, because somebody, like, think about a roads crew. Somebody's a flagger, somebody is in a piece of heavy equipment, and maybe somebody is doing manually shoveling or digging or doing pothole patching, right? All of those are very different tasks. And so in that case, we wouldn't do a roads operator, although they're probably called an operator. We wouldn't just do one PDA for all of those tasks. We would usually recommend you do multiples. And that's really the best way to approach some of those varied tasks within a job. So Lee, if you want to talk about that a little bit more, we certainly have lots of healthcare experience. That's where my business partner Sarah started actually her career. So she has lots of experience doing them in that environment, and we can certainly chat with you about what that might look like, how you might break them down, just pick our brains for a little bit. All right, I don't have any other questions popping up at the moment, so I'm going to say, as folks sign off, I want to be mindful of your time. I do have 3 o'clock here, so I am going to let everybody go. I will stay on a few more minutes. If you do have a question, feel free to send it through to me. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending the webinar, and I hope that if you're in industry, you consider joining us for the industrial conference, even if you aren't the lucky winner of our monthly giveaway. So thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to connecting with you soon.